As Veronica fumed, she continued, "And so she just slammed the door in your face when you went to remind her about her obligations, huh?" "Yeah, Mom. She didn't even bother replying after I reminded her of her promise. And there was a new guy with her at home. I wanted to keep pressing the bell, but then I decided not to risk it. Who knows what he might have done to me?" "What could he have done, Dan? If he even laid a finger on you, I'd drag that brute through the courts," Veronica declared fiercely. "Mom, I'm fine. Don't worry so much or your blood pressure will spike again," Dan tried to calm his mother. "It's already high, son. I thought I'd be going on a vacation to a warm country right after New Year's, but now this snake has divorced you, and I need to get those $35,000 back from her somehow. If I can't go on vacation, let her pay at least in cash. $35,000 isn't easy to come by." "I understand everything, but what am I supposed to do if she won't even talk to me anymore?" Dan asked, exasperation in his voice. He thought, "I should have just booked a hotel room to meet with Julie instead of bringing her home or Nancy Caves." Veronica sighed. "Agreed, you messed up. You'd still be living comfortably and I'd be off on my vacation. But now, without a car, apartment, money, or anything else, you need to be smarter next time. And I'm not talking about that penniless Julie of yours. She has nothing but a child from who knows where. I'll adopt him. We've already discussed it," Dan said proudly, showing he liked his new woman's son. "What? Adopt her son? No way, you're not marrying her. You need to find someone as wealthy as your ex-wife was. Otherwise, how will you live?" Veronica asked in disbelief. "We were planning to live with you," Dan replied, realizing it wouldn't happen. "Never," Veronica shouted. "I tolerate you here because you're my son, but my patience has limits. If you bring that woman and her child here, forget about it." "But Mom, I love her," Dan insisted. "I don't care if she's your destiny. You need a wealthy wife. Sleep with whoever you want later, but I'm not letting you marry that tramp and ruin my plans. Understood?" Veronica's voice grew sharper. Dan stared at the floor, unable to argue. He wanted one thing, but he feared defying his mother. Without her support, he'd be homeless, jobless, and broke. His job was tied to his ex-wife, and after catching him with another woman, Nancy had taken everything, including his employment. "Mom, why do you always make me do what you want? Why can't you let me be happy?" Dan asked, frustration evident in his voice. "You're no saint yourself. You cost me my life. After you were born, I couldn't find a decent man to support us. Now you owe me and you better repay me fully," Veronica stated bluntly, shocking Dan. "You blame me for everything?" he asked, incredulous. "You're the one who cheated on your husband and got dumped. You ruined your own life, not me. Now you want me to fix it." "Yes, you need to fix it. You need to find a wealthy wife and get us those chocolates you keep talking about. Go be your ex-wife and demand what's ours. And if you're afraid of her new man, find a way to avoid him," she ordered. Dan began planning a way to confront his ex-wife in a safer location, feeling a mix of shame and necessity. He couldn't afford to be homeless, and his girlfriend Julie hoped to move in with him. But first, he needed to handle his ex-wife and fulfill his mother's demands to secure his place in her apartment. Since Dan couldn't go to Nancy's new place, knowing her new man, who had been after her even while they were married, now lived with her, he had to come up with another plan. Nancy had only started reciprocating the guy's advances after Dan's huge mistake. Though the bitterness of his betrayal still lingered, her relationship with the new man had begun to blossom. They were living in his apartment while renting out Nancy's old place. Dan knew exactly where his ex-wife was living now, having followed her a few times since their divorce. Unable to visit her at home, Dan decided to wait outside her building, hoping she'd drive herself to work at her store rather than being dropped off by her new man. This time, luck was on his side. Nancy exited the building alone and headed towards her car, parked a bit further from the entrance, an opportunity Dan couldn't miss. "Nancy," he called out. Nancy turned, seeing her ex-husband, her face instantly clouding with irritation. "You again," she muttered. "What do you want now, Dan? Come to beg for something." "I'm not begging. Can't I just talk to you?" Dan replied. "No, you can't," Nancy cut him off harshly. "Since our divorce, all you've done is ask for favors. It's getting old." "What did I ask you for?" Dan, confused by her continued anger, asked. "Oh, let's see," Nancy said, walking towards her car. "You asked me to help your uncle with his accounting. You wanted to borrow my old car, by the way, I sold it. And you demanded that I fund your mom's vacation we had planned before our split." "Wait, you sold the car?" Dan asked, shocked. "Yes, I did. I don't need two cars, and you're nothing to me anymore," Nancy responded coldly. "You also demanded I send your mother on that trip." "But you promised," Dan argued. We had plans. That was before you betrayed me, Dan. Now, I owe you and your family nothing, Nancy replied, getting into her car. Don't ever come to me with your problems again. Can't you at least give me the money for my mom or for the car? Dan asked desperately. Are you out of your mind? Just leave me alone, Dan, Nancy snapped. If you keep bothering me, I'll tell Art, and he'll have his brother and the police handle you. Got it? Before Dan could reply, Nancy drove off, leaving him fuming. In a fit of anger, he picked up a large rock and threw it at her windshield. The glass spider-webbed with cracks but didn't shatter. Nancy didn't stop, knowing Dan had lost it, and drove away quickly to call Art and report the incident. Soon after, Art's brother retrieved security footage, and Nancy filed charges against Dan for harassment and property damage. The court barred Dan from approaching her and ordered him to pay for the repairs and emotional distress. Veronica, furious with Dan's failure and now burdened with more expenses, kicked him out as she had promised. Dan, with no job, home, or support, turned to Julie. However, realizing that her interest in him was mostly for the free housing at his mom's place, she too left him when that prospect vanished. Left with no choice, Dan began looking for any job he could find, relying on friends for temporary shelter until he could earn enough to rent a place of his own. As everyone turned their backs on him, he realized the depth of his mistakes and the long road ahead to rebuild his life. Dan found himself wandering the streets, contemplating his next move. He knew he had to find a way to make things right, not just for himself, but for those he had wronged. He decided to start by apologizing to Nancy, hoping to at least mend some of the damage he had caused. He waited outside her store one evening, catching her as she was closing up. Nancy, please, just hear me out, he pleaded. Nancy sighed, clearly exhausted. What do you want, Dan? I just want to apologize. I know I messed up and I'm sorry for everything. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed to say it, Dan said, his voice sincere. Nancy looked at him for a moment, then nodded. Fine, you said your piece. Now leave me alone. Dan knew it wasn't much, but it was a start. He walked away, feeling a small weight lifted off his shoulders. He knew he had a long way to go, but he was determined to make amends and rebuild his life. He found a job at a local diner, working long hours to save up enough money for a place of his own. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a start. He slowly began to rebuild his life, one step at a time. Months passed, and Dan found himself in a better place. He had a steady job, a small apartment, and had even reconnected with some old friends. He knew he still had a lot to make up for, but he was on the right path. One day, as he was walking home from work, he saw Julie standing outside his apartment building. She looked nervous, but hopeful. Dan, can we talk? She asked. Dan nodded, inviting her inside. They sat down, and Julie began to speak. I'm sorry for how things ended between us. I was wrong to leave you when things got tough. I want to make things right. Dan listened, feeling a mix of emotions. He knew he had made mistakes, but he also knew he had grown and changed. Julie, I appreciate your apology. I've been working hard to turn my life around, and I'm not the same person I was. Julie nodded, tears in her eyes. I know, and I want to be a part of your life again. I want to help you rebuild. Dan took a deep breath, considering her words. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he also knew that everyone deserved a second chance. All right, let's take it one step at a time. Together, they began to rebuild their relationship, taking things slowly and working through their issues. Dan knew it would be a long road, but he was ready to face it head-on, with Julie by his side. As time went on, Dan found himself in a much better place. He had a stable job, a loving partner, and had even mended some of the broken relationships in his life. He knew he still had a lot to make up for, but he was on the right path. Looking back, Dan realized that his mistakes had taught him valuable lessons. He had learned the importance of honesty, hard work, and perseverance. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he could work towards a better future. And so,